I grew up in a pretty rural part of Ohio, in a neighborhood where houses were spaced really far apart. We didn't have fences separating our properties, just endless stretches of tall grass and dense tree lines that kind of meshed everything together. I was an only child, so I spent a lot of time entertaining myself, usually by wandering around the perimeter of our huge backyard. When I was around 9 years old, my dad helped me build a wooden clubhouse. It was situated at the absolute farthest edge of our backyard, right where the freshly mowed lawn met this incredibly thick, untamed patch of woods. It wasn't anything fancy, just some plywood walls, a heavy wooden door with a simple metal latch on the outside, and a small, square cutout for a window that we covered with mosquito netting. To my 9-year-old mind, that clubhouse was my ultimate sanctuary. It was mid-July, one of those suffocatingly humid summer nights where the air just feels heavy. I had relentlessly begged my parents to let me sleep out in the clubhouse overnight. It felt like a rite of passage, a real adventure. Eventually, they caved, but only on the condition that I took our golden retriever Buster out there with me. Around 8 p.m., my dad walked me out, helped me lay out my sleeping bag, and locked the metal latch from the outside so the door wouldn't blow open. He told me if I needed to come in, I could just push the door hard and the latch would pop up. I was so excited. I got into my sleeping bag, whipped out my Game Boy Advance, and started playing Pokemon Emerald. But about an hour in, Buster got incredibly skittish. He kept pacing around the small wooden floor, whining, panting, and scratching frantically at the door. He just wouldn't settle down. I figured the summer heat was too much for him, so I pushed the door open and watched him sprint back to the brightly lit back porch of our main house. My dad let him inside and flashed the porch light twice, our signal for good night. So, now I was out there, entirely alone. I went back to playing my game, but after a few hours the batteries died. The screen went black, and the sudden, pitch-dark silence of the night felt overwhelming. It wasn't completely dark, just a faint grayish hue from the moonlight bleeding through the mosquito netting of the window. I laid there, trying to force myself to sleep, but the plywood floor was painfully uncomfortable. I must have finally dozed off, because I remember waking up suddenly. I was disoriented for a second, not quite registering where I was. And then I realized why I had woken up. The crickets and cicadas, they had completely stopped chirping. Everything outside was dead silent. I laid completely still inside my sleeping bag, listening. Then I heard it, the slow, deliberate crunch of dry leaves and snapping twigs. It was coming from the deep woods directly behind the clubhouse. I froze. The footsteps were heavy, not the quick scurrying of a raccoon or a deer. They were the rhythmic, bipedal steps of a person. I heard them slowly step out of the tree line and onto the soft grass of our backyard. I was absolutely paralyzed. I didn't want to move, but the small square window was just a few feet above me. My morbid curiosity took over. I slowly, so incredibly slowly, lifted my head and peeked over the wooden ledge, looking through the thin mesh screen. Standing about 20 feet away in the yard, bathed in the pale moonlight, was a grown man. He was facing my house, just staring at my parents' dark bedroom window on the second floor. He was incredibly tall, and he was wearing a heavy, dark winter coat, which made absolutely no sense in the sweltering July heat. I stopped breathing. I was hoping, praying, that it was just my dad out for a late-night smoke. But my dad wasn't that tall, and he definitely wouldn't be wearing a coat. I held completely still, but as I shifted my weight, the old plywood floorboards beneath me let out a sharp creak. The man's head snapped with terrifying speed, looking directly at the clubhouse. He knew I was in there. I dropped flat onto the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. I heard his heavy footsteps start moving across the grass, heading straight for the clubhouse. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could hear it. The footsteps stopped right outside the wooden wall, just inches from my head. I could hear his ragged, uneven breathing. Then, the metal latch on the door began to rattle. He was slowly lifting the latch up and down, testing it. He didn't push the door. He was just playing with the lock. I wanted to scream for my dad, but my throat was completely closed up with fear. There was a small knothole in the wood near the bottom of the door, just a tiny gap where a piece of wood had rotted out. I was staring at it in the dark when a shadow suddenly blocked the moonlight shining through it. An eye pressed right against the hole. Just one wide, unblinking eye, searching the darkness of the clubhouse, looking right at me. I could hear him let out a soft, amused hum. That was when my voice finally came back. I let out a blood-curdling, desperate scream. I kicked wildly at the walls, making as much noise as humanly possible. I heard the man slam his hand violently against the door once, and then his heavy footsteps took off, sprinting frantically back into the deep woods. A second later, my house's back porch light flipped on, and my dad came bursting out the back door, holding a baseball bat and yelling my name. By the time he got to the clubhouse and pulled the door open, the man was long gone. The police came. They searched the woods with flashlights, but they found nothing except some trampled brush. I slept in my parents' room for weeks. I refused to ever set foot in that clubhouse again, and my dad eventually tore it down. Things slowly went back to normal. My parents convinced me it was just a drifter passing through. I started to believe them, until about 2 months later. I was at a local grocery store with my mom. She was looking at produce, and I had wandered over to the magazine rack near the front registers. There weren't many people in the store. I was reading a comic when I felt someone standing entirely too close behind me. I turned around, and my stomach completely dropped. It was a tall man in a normal t-shirt. I had only seen the man in my yard briefly in the dark, but the height, the posture, the intense, unblinking eyes, I knew it was him. I felt like I was going to throw up. He looked down at me and smiled this terrible, slow smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a cheap, yellow plastic flashlight. My flashlight. The exact one I had accidentally dropped on the grass outside the clubhouse that night. He didn't say a single word. He just gently placed the flashlight on top of the magazine rack, winked at me with that same eye I saw through the knothole, and calmly walked out the sliding glass doors into the parking lot. I never saw him again, but the thought that he took a souvenir and tracked me down just to let me know he still had it makes me sick to my stomach to this day. When I was 22, I had just graduated and decided to move out on my own. I rented a small house on the outskirts of town, a pretty quiet and sparsely populated area. Since I was just starting to work and on a tight budget, I bought almost everything by browsing for used items on buying and selling apps, especially Facebook Marketplace. At the time, I had borrowed my uncle's empty box truck, so hauling bulky furniture myself was a breeze. One afternoon in mid-October, when it was starting to get dark earlier than usual, I stumbled upon a furniture clearance post with an unbelievably cheap price. It was an account with no clear profile picture, selling a solid oak desk and a vintage leather chair for just 1/10 of their actual value. In the photos, the items looked absolutely perfect, shiny and elegant. The seller included a caption, "Moving out of state urgently tonight, selling fast to anyone who can pick it up themselves." I messaged them immediately. The man replied incredibly fast. His tone was blunt, and he had absolutely no intention of haggling or negotiating. He sent me an address and told me I could come get them tonight. I checked the address on my phone's map. It was located in a pretty remote area, about a 40-minute drive from the center of town, nestled deep in an area surrounded by harvested cornfields and barren tree lines. But because the deal was just too good, I decided to start the engine and head out. Around 7 p.m., I turned onto the dirt road leading into the property. This road dragged on endlessly, lined on both sides with dark, skeletal trees that blocked out even the faint moonlight. My tires crunched over the gravel, creating dry, hollow sounds in the dead silence. Finally, the road opened up to a massive dirt yard. Standing ominously in the middle was an old-style farmhouse, 2 stories tall, with white paint peeling off in jagged patches. None of the lights inside were on, except for a dim, sickly yellow bulb flickering on the front porch. I slowly parked the truck. There were no other cars around, except for a rusty, enclosed box truck with no license plates, parked out of sight behind some bushes. This scene looked absolutely nothing like someone preparing to move out of state. I stepped out of the vehicle, a slight chill starting to creep down my spine. I walked up to the front door, ready to knock, but just as my hand touched the doorknob, I noticed a yellow post-it note stuck neatly to the wood. Scrawled on it in black marker were the words, "Busy cleaning up down in the wine cellar out back. The stuff is ready down there. Just open the cellar doors and come on down. Bring cash." A wave of cold air ran straight down my back. I pulled out my phone and opened the messenger app to text the seller, letting him know I had arrived. A few minutes passed. The message status changed to read, but he didn't reply at all. I really should have just turned my truck around and left right then, but my curiosity and my reluctance to give up on that gorgeous furniture pushed me to walk around the side of the house to the backyard. The grass in the backyard was knee-high. There was a slanted wooden cellar door built into the ground, the old kind they use for storm shelters. The door was propped wide open, revealing a narrow set of concrete stairs leading down into the deep, pitch blackness. There was only a faint, weak beam of light from an incandescent bulb casting up from the bottom of the cellar. I stood at the edge of the opening and called down. "Hello? I'm here to pick up the desk." No answer, just the sound of the wind softly hissing through the dry grass. I swallowed hard, turned on my phone's flashlight, and carefully stepped down the first 3 steps. The further down I went, the stronger the smell of damp mold, rot, and wet earth became. When my feet finally touched the packed dirt floor of the cellar, I swept my flashlight around. There was indeed a wooden desk and a leather chair sitting right in the middle of the cavernous cellar, but they looked absolutely nothing like the pictures online. They were ruined, broken, and covered in a thick layer of dust and a tangled mess of cobwebs. They looked like garbage that had been dumped down here decades ago. This wasn't stuff for sale. It was bait. My heart started hammering in my chest. I quickly backed away, keeping my eyes locked on the concrete stairs, getting ready to run. But my footsteps suddenly froze. Over in the darkest corner of the cellar, right behind the rotting desk, someone was standing there. My flashlight beam swept past, and I was dead silent. It wasn't just one person. There were at least 4 people standing completely still in the dark. They were pressed tight against the wall, their bodies as rigid as wax statues. 2 men, 2 women, wearing filthy, tattered clothes. And the most horrifying part was that all of them were staring right at me, with their necks tilted to the side at a completely unnatural angle. Their eyes were wide open, glaring through the darkness, and across each of their faces was a massive grin stretching from ear to ear. A completely hollow smile, without making a single sound. They didn't step forward, they just stood there, smiling and watching me. At that exact moment, an ear-piercing creak echoed from directly above my head. I looked up in sheer panic. The heavy wooden cellar door was slowly being pushed down by someone from the outside. and that single, flickering light bulb down in the cellar suddenly clicked off. Absolute, pure terror exploded in my brain. I let out a roar, completely ignoring the people standing in the corner. Using every ounce of strength a 22-year-old guy could muster, I sprinted up the concrete steps. I shoved my hand straight up against the wooden door, just as it was only inches away from shutting completely, using my shoulders and my head to ram it back open. There was a heavy weight pressing down from the outside, but my desperate need to survive was stronger. The door burst open. I tumbled out into the overgrown weeds, scraping my knees until they bled. I didn't dare look back to see who was standing at the edge of the cellar. I scrambled to my feet, sprinting as fast as my legs could carry me toward the truck. I dove into the driver's seat, slammed the locks down with a loud click, cranked the ignition, and slammed it into reverse like a madman, not even caring that the undercarriage was tearing up the gravel yard. As I cranked the steering wheel to whip the truck back onto the dirt road, I accidentally caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror. The front door of the house was wide open now, and those people, the ones standing down in the cellar, were stepping out onto the front porch. They stood in a straight line under that sickly yellow light, arms hanging limply by their sides, still holding those twisted smiles on their faces, just silently watching my truck disappear into the dark. I drove straight to the nearest police station, which was nearly 10 miles away. They dispatched 2 patrol cars to the property that very night. The next morning, an officer called me. He told me the property was owned by a bank and had been abandoned for over 7 years. No one lived there. When the cops arrived, the house was completely empty. No rusty box truck, no people anywhere. But when they went down into the cellar, they found the broken desk, along with dozens of heavy-duty zip ties, duct tape, and rags stained with dried, blackened blood, carefully hidden away in a dark corner. That Facebook Marketplace account had also completely vanished without a trace. Even now, every time night falls, my chest tightens when I think about it. If I hadn't managed to bust through that cellar door before it slammed shut, what kind of toy would I have become for those sick, smiling people? A perfect trap, set up just waiting for someone like me, looking for a cheap deal and traveling alone, to fall right into it. Last autumn, I agreed to house sit for my great-uncle for about 2 weeks while he traveled abroad. It was a gorgeous 2-story wooden cabin, but it was located in an incredibly remote area on the outskirts of Washington state. The house had no immediate neighbors. The front faced a long, winding gravel road, and the back sat right on the edge of a deep, dark, natural lake. The back of the house featured a wooden deck that extended far out over the water, forming a small dock to tie up kayaks. I've always loved the quiet, so staying alone in such a desolate place initially seemed like the perfect getaway. But things started getting weird on Saturday afternoon. It was around 4 p.m. The sky was still relatively bright, but a thick fog was already starting to roll in over the water. I was holding a skimmer net, scooping up dead leaves around the wooden dock, when suddenly I heard a massive, violent splash. It echoed from a dense patch of tall reeds just about 20 yards away from the dock. It wasn't the quick flap of a fish jumping. It sounded exactly like a massive, heavy object had just slid off the grassy bank and plunged into the water, sinking immediately. I froze, squinting hard at the reeds. The water there was murky, churning with ripples, but no animal ever surfaced. I got this indescribable chill down my spine, a feeling like someone was holding their breath right under that muddy water, just waiting for me to turn my back. But I eventually convinced myself It was probably just a large river otter or a heavy dead log slipping down the embankment. That night, to shake off the lingering sense of emptiness, I invited my two best friends, Mike and Dan, over to hang out. We grilled burgers out on the deck, drank some beers, and played music. Having loud, familiar company around made the dock and the pitch-black lake behind it feel a lot less creepy. Around 1 a.m., the temperature dropped sharply, and the fog grew so dense that visibility out over the lake was practically zero. Mike and Dan said their goodbyes and drove home. I stayed downstairs to clean up the empty bottles, turned off all the patio lights, and meticulously checked the lock on the sliding glass door that led from the deck into the living room. Absolutely certain it was locked tight. I headed up to the second-floor bedroom. I laid in bed, scrolling through my phone for about an hour. It was so dead silent that I could hear the faint whistle of the wind slipping through the window frames. And then, cutting through that suffocating silence, I heard a sound. Squish. Squelch. It was the sound of someone wading through water. The slow, heavy, deliberate footsteps of someone pushing through the shallows, heading straight for the wooden dock. My eyes snapped wide open in the dark. I held my breath, straining my ears to listen. I heard the distinct slap of two soaking wet hands gripping the edge of the wooden planks, and then the heavy, straining sound of a massive body hauling itself up out of the water. I instantly threw off my blankets, tiptoeing barefoot to the bedroom window to look straight down at the backyard. I didn't turn on a single light because I didn't want whoever was down there to know I was awake. The fog was incredibly thick, but thanks to a faint sliver of moonlight piercing through, I saw him. A terrifyingly tall man standing completely still on the dock. He wasn't wearing a life jacket or a wetsuit. He was just wearing regular, everyday street clothes that were completely waterlogged, clinging tight to his massive frame. I could hear the water dripping off his body, heavily drumming against the wooden planks. He didn't look rushed or sneaky. He just stood there, completely motionless, and slowly tilted his head up, staring directly at my bedroom window. He had been watching this house. He knew exactly which room I was in. My heart practically stopped beating. I slowly backed away from the window, not even daring to breathe too loudly. I heard his soaking wet footsteps start pacing along the wooden deck, heading straight for the sliding glass door on the ground floor. He wasn't running. He wasn't hesitating. He walked with this bone-chilling calmness, as if he was taking a casual stroll through his own home. I dove for the nightstand, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. While I was waiting for the dispatcher to pick up, I heard a sound that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. Click, clack. The sliding glass door downstairs, the door I would have sworn on my life I had securely locked, had just been slid open. He was inside the house. The 911 dispatcher answered. I pressed the phone hard against my ear, whispering in a voice trembling with absolute terror. "Someone broke into my house. Please hurry." I quickly rattled off the address, and right at that moment, the footsteps became horrifyingly clear. Slap, squeak. Slap, squeak. Slow, incredibly heavy footsteps pressing down on the hardwood floor downstairs, accompanied by the continuous, rhythmic dripping of water pooling onto the boards. He wasn't rummaging through the living room. He wasn't looking for valuables to steal. He was walking straight toward the bottom of the stairs. The old wooden steps let out agonizing, mournful creaks under his immense weight. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. He was coming upstairs. I scrambled to the bedroom door, twisted the deadbolt with a tiny click, and backed myself all the way into the far corner of the room, tightly gripping my uncle's heavy baseball bat. The dripping footsteps stopped, right outside my bedroom door. A deathly silence took over. I could hear his raspy, steady breathing on the other side of the flimsy wood. A dark, murky puddle was slowly seeping into the room through the gap under the door. The brass doorknob suddenly twisted violently, once and then twice. When he realized it was locked, the handle slowly released. He paused for a beat, and then he knocked. 3 slow, booming knocks. I gripped the phone tighter, screaming in a hoarse, desperate voice, "The police are on their way! You better get the hell out of here!" An agonizingly long silence followed. Then a voice spoke from the hallway. But it wasn't the voice of a gruff stranger. "Open the door. It's me. It's Dan. I forgot my car keys." Goosebumps erupted over every inch of my body. It was the exact tone and pitch of Dan, my best friend who had left over an hour ago. But the cadence was completely wrong. It was flat, lifeless, dragging out each word in this robotic, chilling way that lacked any trace of human emotion. It sounded like something had been eavesdropping on our conversations on the deck, and was now trying to mimic those sounds just to trick me into opening the door. I didn't answer. I just stood there shaking, tears welling up in my eyes out of pure terror. Seeming to realize the trick had failed, the thing outside let out a long, wet sigh. The dripping footsteps started up again, turning around, walking down the hallway, and slowly descending the stairs. A few dozen seconds later, I heard the sliding glass door downstairs slide shut. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, their red and blue lights illuminating the entire cove. When I finally dared to step out of my room, the scene left behind made even the most seasoned officers shiver. Nothing was stolen. The only proof that someone had been in the house was a thick trail of murky water, reeking of mud and foul algae, stretching from the dock, through the glass door, up every single step of the staircase, and pooling into a massive puddle right outside my bedroom door. The cops took a boat out to sweep the water around the reeds, but they found no one. My friend Dan was sound asleep in his own bed 10 miles away when the police called to verify. To this day, I refuse to go anywhere near a lake at night. No one knows who that man was, how he managed to unlock the door from the outside, and most terrifyingly of all, if I had been fooled that night and turned the lock to open my bedroom door, what exactly was waiting for me in the dark, wearing that soaking wet skin? It was late November of 2023. I was working a contract job out of Coldfoot, Alaska, and I needed to transport a modified utility truck up to the oil fields in Deadhorse for the weekend. If you have never driven the James Dalton Highway in the middle of winter, it is a stark, brutal stretch of road. During clear weather, the landscape is incredibly vast, but when the weather turns, it becomes a genuine nightmare. There are long stretches with zero cell service, no infrastructure, no lights, and almost no other traffic outside of the occasional heavy freight rig. It is a profoundly isolating place, really. I left the camp in Coldfoot around 9 p.m. on a Thursday. My supervisor, a guy named Cyprian, told me I was making a mistake and should wait until morning, which was probably true in hindsight. I had an early deadline at the northern facility and figured I would rather just grind through the drive and sleep when I got there. Famous last words, I guess. The first couple of hours were manageable. The Dalton is mostly packed ice and gravel this time of year, and it eventually narrows and steepens as you approach the Brooks Range. I was somewhere near Chandelar Shelf, just starting the approach toward Adigan Pass, when the wind picked up and the snow started blowing. Ground blizzards on the tundra are not unusual, but this localized system was different. Within maybe 5 minutes, it went from decent visibility to an absolute whiteout. I could barely see 20 feet ahead of the hood of my truck. The snow was blowing horizontally, creating a hypnotic strobing effect in my headlights. It was severe, worse than I am describing. I dropped my speed down to maybe 20 miles per hour and kept moving. The smart thing would have been to pull off the road and wait it out, but there are virtually no safe shoulders on Adigan Pass. If you pull over, you risk sliding off the grade or getting buried by a plow. And honestly, I just wanted to get to the facility. I figured if I took it extremely slow, I would be fine. Here's the thing about a whiteout blizzard, though. Anyone who drives in extreme winter conditions knows this, but it entirely erases your sense of space. You cannot see the horizon, you cannot see landmarks, you cannot tell where the ice road ends and the drop-off begins. You cannot see what is coming up ahead. It is aggressively disorienting, especially when you are already dealing with the mental fatigue of night driving. After another hour or so of tense, crawling progress, I saw a figure standing off the right side of the road. I say figure because that is exactly what it registered as initially, just an upright shape in the swirling white, maybe 50 feet ahead. As I rolled closer, I could see it was a person. It was a man, easily over 6 feet tall, wearing a faded, heavily stained yellow extreme cold survival suit. He was just standing there on the edge of the ice, facing the road. He was not walking or waving his arms to flag me down like he needed a lift, and it did not look like he was injured or fixing gear either. He was genuinely just standing completely still. I slowed the truck down to a crawl as I passed, because I was worried he might suddenly step out onto the ice in front of me. He did not move, though. He did not even turn his head to watch my heavy truck roll by, which sent a cold spike of dread through my chest. I got a decent look at him through the passenger window as I passed. His hood was up, and there was nothing about his face that I could make out due to a thick layer of frost clinging to the fur trim. My immediate thought was that his snowmobile or truck had broken down somewhere in the dark, and he was waiting for a ride, which would make sense, right? Except, I had not passed any disabled vehicles in the ditch, and there was absolutely no reason for him to be standing in that exact spot, facing that exact direction, miles away from any shelter. There was nothing out there but frozen tundra. I thought about hitting the brakes and backing up to ask if he needed extraction, but something about the posture, the absolute stillness in that violent wind, felt entirely wrong. It was not my problem, so I kept driving. About 20 minutes later, though, I saw him again. I am not exaggerating. It was the exact same man. Same build, same heavily stained yellow survival suit, same rigid stance on the edge of the road. The only difference was that this time, he was standing on the left side of the highway instead of the right, but everything else was identical. I spoke out loud to the empty cab, trying to process it, because there was physically no way this person could have gotten ahead of me. I was the only vehicle on the pass, and there were no cross streets or shortcuts or anything like that. The only rational explanation was that it was a different person who simply happened to look exactly like the first guy, wearing the exact same obscure gear and standing in exactly the same unsettling manner. I did not want to look at him as I passed, but I could not stop myself. I had to confirm whether it was the same guy, and after getting a close look, I was dead certain it was. But this time, the guy actually locked eyes with me through the frosted glass as I passed, and I could not look away fast enough. Seeing his head snap sideways to follow my truck was really freaky, and I instantly regretted making eye contact. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing the truck to 35 miles per hour. I wasn't trying to slide off the road, but I wanted distance between me and whatever the hell was going on back there. The whiteout conditions worsened near the peak of the pass, though. I could barely see the plow markers at that point, so I really had no choice but to slow back down. I was having trouble thinking straight, which I attributed to the mixed effect of how tired I was, how hard it was to drive, and what I had just seen. I kept trying to rationalize it, but I couldn't. My train of thought was interrupted, though, because not 5 minutes later, my high beams exposed something ahead. There was another person up there, only this time, he was standing dead center in the middle of my lane. I had no choice but to stop, which is exactly what I did. The anti-lock brakes engaged violently as the heavy truck slid on the ice, coming to a halt just 15 feet away from him. It was the same man in the stained yellow suit. His hood was pulled low, so I still couldn't see what exactly he looked like, but I knew it was him. He once again did not move, which is when I started really getting scared. We were at a standstill, and even though I couldn't see his face clearly, I could feel him looking at me. I didn't know what to do. I flashed my brights at him a few times and hit the air horn, trying to get him to move out of the way or at the very least react. But he didn't. I grabbed the shifter to put the truck in reverse, and when I looked in my driver's side mirror, my heart stopped. There was someone else. Another figure in a yellow suit was crawling out from beneath the rear axle of my truck, reaching up with a thick glove to grip the edge of the cargo bed. I shouted in panic and slammed the shifter back into drive. I was boxed in, but I didn't care. There was an actual threat on my life now. I cranked the steering wheel hard to the right, aiming for the narrow sliver of ice between the figure in the road and the steep drop-off. The figure in the road didn't flinch as I accelerated past him, and I thought I was in the clear. But then something hit the back of my truck. It wasn't just a bump, it was a massive, violent force. The entire rear of the heavy utility truck jerked backward and down, the suspension bottoming out hard. I heard this horrific, screaming sound of thick steel tearing and bending. I kept my foot pinned on the gas, thinking I had caught the rear end on a hidden guardrail or a snowplow blade buried in the drift. But when I checked my mirrors, there was nothing behind me. Nothing at all. Not even the figures in the yellow suits. As if the situation wasn't already terrifying enough, the sheer emptiness of the road made it so much worse. I wasn't waiting, though. I drove recklessly fast until I descended the pass and the blizzard finally broke into light flurries. By the time I hit the northern plains, I could actually see again, and for the first time, my brain started to relax. But the more I calmed down, the more I thought about what had happened. And this might sound surprising, but I genuinely concluded that I hallucinated everything. Here is the thing. I had been driving for almost 5 hours at that point. I was exhausted. I had been staring into blowing snow for God knows how long, completely alone on a dark, freezing highway. So, an extremely vivid hallucination didn't seem that far-fetched to me. Why it was so oddly specific was beyond me, but there was no other explanation for me having seen those impossible figures, or having felt a wreck that didn't actually involve another vehicle. By the time I made it to the Dead Horse facility, I was just ready to sleep the whole thing off and forget about it. But the next afternoon, I walked out to the depot lot to inspect the truck. The heavy steel drop bumper was destroyed. There was a massive distortion running across the right side of it, which meant whatever hit me had hit me way harder than I thought. It also meant that I actually had experienced a physical impact, meaning I hadn't hallucinated anything. I stood in the freezing wind, staring at the damage for several minutes. There wasn't any paint transfer, which there definitely would have been if I had backed into a snowplow or another truck. But if it wasn't a vehicle or a concrete barrier, I had no idea what could have caused such considerable damage. What I keep coming back to is the metal itself. The bumper wasn't pushed inward like it would be in a crash. The thick steel was peeled and bent violently outward, pulled away from the frame of the truck, with deep parallel gouges scored into the bare metal. Whatever had been out there in the whiteout hadn't just collided with me. It had grabbed the back of a moving 6-ton truck and tried to rip it backward. This took place during the late autumn of last year. I was subletting a small, isolated cabin in Sonnet, Massachusetts. I work as a freelance archivist, which means I spend the vast majority of my days hunched over a laptop, digitizing old municipal records and transcribing severely damaged documents. The property was owned by a guy named Oswin, an older man who spent most of the year in Florida, leaving the cabin empty and dirt cheap to rent. The main drawback of staying in a Sonnet during November is the profound, suffocating quiet. It is a very old part of New England, heavily forested and sparsely populated. When you are out there, you are essentially living on the border of the Freetown Fall River State Forest, a massive expanse of dense woods, swamps, and rocky outcroppings. Because my work is entirely sedentary and requires intense, narrow focus, I usually combat the inevitable cabin fever by going for a long, aggressive hike every single afternoon. I need to physically exhaust myself just to be able to sleep at night. I had established a very rigid routine. There is a specific, unpaved logging route off Coppicut Road that loops entirely through the state forest. It is exactly 4.2 miles from the rusted iron gate at the entrance back to the small dirt pull-off where I would park my car. The route takes you through a mile of dense white pines, transitions into a lower, slightly marshy section with heavy brush, and then gradually inclines back up a rocky ridge before depositing you right back at the gate. I am a creature of extreme habit. I ran or speedwalked this exact loop every single day for 6 weeks. I knew every exposed root, every dip in the elevation, and every dead, lightning-struck tree along the path. It was a single, continuous fire road. There were no intersecting trails, no forks, and no divergent paths. You go in, you follow the dirt, and you come out. Getting lost was functionally impossible. I wore a high-end Garmin Fenix watch to track my heart rate, pace, and GPS distance, strictly logging my times to make sure I wasn't slacking off. On a Tuesday afternoon, around 3:30 p.m., I drove to the pull-off to do my daily circuit. The sun sets incredibly early in New England during November, usually dipping below the tree line by 4:15 p.m., leaving the woods in a prolonged, shadowy twilight. I wasn't worried about the fading light. I had a heavy-duty headlamp in my pack, and I knew the route well enough to navigate it in the dark if absolutely necessary. The only anomaly when I arrived was the mist. I hesitate to even call it fog. It was not rolling in from the coast or drifting through the canopy. It seemed to be seeping directly out of the freezing ground. It was an incredibly dense, stagnant white vapor that clung to the pine needles and the frozen dirt. I have hiked in heavy weather before, but this was uniquely oppressive. It looked completely artificial, like the heavy, low-lying smoke they use on movie sets. Visibility was immediately cut down to maybe 20 feet in any direction. The air felt incredibly heavy, carrying a bizarre, metallic scent that I couldn't place. I debated turning back and just doing a workout on the cabin floor, but the isolation was already getting to my head. I needed the fresh air. I locked my car, started the tracking app on my watch, and slipped past the iron gate into the woods. The mist swallowed the ambient light almost immediately. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to blur into flat, gray silhouettes. I maintained a brisk, heavy pace, jogging the flat sections and power walking the inclines. For the first 2 miles, everything was entirely standard, minus the claustrophobia induced by the weather. I couldn't see the canopy above me, and I couldn't see further than a few car lengths ahead, but the packed dirt of the trail was unmistakable beneath my boots. I checked my watch at the 2-mile mark. My pace was slightly slower than my average, mostly because I was being cautious of my footing in the low visibility. The psychological unraveling began exactly at the 3-mile mark. At 3 miles, according to the strict geography of the loop, I should have been passing a massive, fractured granite boulder that sits on the left side of the trail, marking the beginning of the final upward incline. I know this boulder intimately. I use it as a mental checkpoint to push my pace for the final stretch. But when my Garmin vibrated to signal the 3rd mile, there was no boulder. There was no incline. I was still walking on perfectly flat, soft dirt, surrounded by the identical, tightly packed white pines that populate the middle section of the forest. I stopped walking and tapped the screen of my watch, assuming the GPS had dropped signal. The Freetown State Forest is notorious for dead zones, so a localized glitch wasn't out of the realm of possibility. But the watch was actively tracking. It showed my live pace, my heart rate, and a perfectly uninterrupted breadcrumb trail of my route. I rationalized it exactly the way anyone would. I told myself the heavy mist and the dense tree cover were interfering with the satellite triangulation, causing the watch to overestimate my distance. I took a drink of water, readjusted my pack, and kept jogging. I just needed to keep moving forward. It was a straight line. The exit had to be there. 30 minutes later, the watch buzzed again. 4 miles. I stopped dead in the middle of the trail. My breathing was heavy, vaporizing in the freezing air in front of my face. The sun had officially set, and the ambient twilight in the woods was rapidly decaying into a profound, suffocating darkness. I clicked on my headlamp. The beam of light did not pierce the mist. It simply illuminated a solid white wall of vapor just 15 feet ahead of me. At 4 miles, I should have been standing at my car, but as I panned the beam of my headlamp around, all I saw were the same endless vertical trunks of the white pines. I had not hit the marshy section. I had not hit the rocky incline. I had been walking on the exact same stretch of flat dirt for over an hour. A very cold, primal panic began to leak into my chest. I am a rational man. I deal in archives, in recorded history, in measurable facts. Geography does not stretch. A 4.2-mile closed loop does not suddenly contain 5 miles of identical straightaway. The only logical explanation was that I had somehow stepped off the main logging road and onto a deer trail, or an unmapped surveyor's path. But I looked down at the ground. It was 8 feet wide, deeply compacted by decades of heavy vehicle use. It was the right road. My watch ticked over to 4.5 miles. The number kept slowly creeping up, even though I was standing completely still. My mind completely rejected what I was looking at. The technology was failing, and my perception of time and distance was failing with it. The only sane, logical option left was to abort the loop. If I turned around and walked back the exact way I came, I would inevitably hit the iron gate. I had only been walking in one direction. Reverse the direction, reverse the outcome. I spun around, facing the dark void of the trail I had just traversed, and began to speed walk. I was nearly running, driven by a sudden, desperate need to get out from under the canopy. That is when the sound started. The Freetown Forest is usually devoid of heavy wildlife noise in the late autumn, especially at night. But out of the thick, freezing mist behind me came a noise that made every muscle in my back lock into place. It was not a vocalization. It was a heavy, rhythmic, grinding thud. It sounded like 2 massive, wet stones being struck together, followed instantly by a long, vibrating exhalation of air that sounded like a punctured lung. Thud crack. Wheeze. It was coming from the trail directly behind me, maybe 30 feet back, entirely obscured by the white vapor. I froze. The sound immediately stopped. I held my breath, straining my ears against the absolute silence of the woods. Nothing moved. There was no wind. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, my boot crunching on the freezing dirt. From the mist behind me, thud, crack. It took a step the exact moment I did. Panic completely overrode my nervous system. I didn't look back. I broke into a full, desperate sprint. I am not a small guy, and I run heavy, but the sound behind me effortlessly matched my pace. As my boots pounded the dirt, the grinding, snapping noise accelerated into a horrific, rhythmic pounding. It was heavy. Whatever was making that noise had incredible mass. I could literally feel the subtle vibrations in the ground through the soles of my shoes. And the wheezing, the wet, rattling exhalations grew louder, maintaining the exact same distance no matter how fast I pushed myself. I was sprinting at maximum capacity, my lungs burning, my legs flooded with lactic acid, blindly following the narrow beam of my headlamp through the suffocating white mist. I ran for what felt like an eternity. I ran until I tasted blood in the back of my throat. I ran until my vision started to blur at the edges from oxygen deprivation. I was trapped in an endless, flat corridor of identical trees, being chased by something that did not need to breathe, did not need to rest, and refused to close the distance. It was simply hurting me. Just as my legs were about to buckle, the ground suddenly changed. The dirt turned to broken asphalt. The trees abruptly parted. I burst through the mist and stumbled forward, violently impacting the rusted iron gate at the entrance of the trail. The momentum sent me sprawling over the metal bar and crashing onto the gravel shoulder of Copacut Road. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, scraping my palms raw on the asphalt, and stared back at the tree line. The mist did not bleed out onto the road. It stopped exactly at the edge of the forest, forming a towering, impenetrable wall of swirling white vapor. The grinding, thudding sound had ceased the exact second I crossed the threshold of the gate. I lay there on the cold road, gasping for air, my chest heaving violently. Slowly, I lifted my headlamp to illuminate the space just behind the iron gate. Standing roughly 10 feet back, just inside the veil of the mist, was a silhouette. It was a completely light-absorbing, pitch-black mass. It was impossibly tall. If I had to estimate, the crown of its shape reached at least 9 feet into the air, forcing it to stoop beneath the lower branches of the pines. It was disproportionately narrow, lacking the bulk or width of a bear or a moose. It looked like a jagged, vertical tear in the fabric of the mist itself. It did not advance toward the gate. It merely stood there, swaying ever so slightly from side to side in complete, dead silence. I did not wait to see if it would step out. I dragged myself up, got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away from the state forest at a speed that was deeply unsafe. I left the cabin in Asanet the very next morning, breaking my sublet agreement with Oswin, and I have never returned to Massachusetts. I check the data on my Garmin app sometimes, just to remind myself that my mind wasn't breaking. The map shows a completely erratic, impossible red line that spirals out into the empty space of the forest map, registering an impossible 9.4 miles traveled in a straight line inside a 4-mile loop. This took place in late January of 2018. My longtime wilderness partner, an incredibly stoic guy named Caius, and I had been meticulously planning a multi-day backcountry paddling trip through the Congaree National Park in South Carolina. If you are not familiar with the geography of Congaree, it is not your standard national park. It is the largest intact expanse of old-growth bottomland hardwood forest left in the southeastern United States. When the nearby Congaree and Wateree rivers flood, the entire forest floor goes underwater, creating a massive primeval swamp filled with towering bald cypress trees, loblolly pines, and dense, twisting knees protruding from the black water. Neither Caius nor I were novices. We had been running Class 4 rapids and doing remote wilderness canoeing for over a decade. Caius actually held certifications in swiftwater rescue and wilderness first responder protocols. We knew exactly what we were doing, how to read water, and how to navigate without reliance on digital technology. That context is vital for what I am about to explain, because I need it absolutely clear that we were not two inexperienced tourists who got spooked by the local wildlife or a little bad weather. We understand acoustics on the water. We understand the mechanics of shallow water navigation. We launched our separate touring kayaks at dawn from the Bannister Bridge access point, intending to navigate the entire 15-mile stretch of Cedar Creek down to the river. The morning we chose was aggressively unseasonable. A massive temperature inversion had trapped a thick, suffocating layer of radiation fog directly over the floodplain. We anticipated it would burn off by 10 in the morning as the sun breached the heavy canopy, which is standard for the region. We carried maritime compasses, waterproof topographical maps, and emergency beacons. The first 90 minutes were genuinely breathtaking in a stark, isolating way. Paddling through flooded, old-growth timber and heavy fog muffles the world entirely. The cypress trees loom out of the white vapor like massive gray pillars, and the Spanish moss hangs down to brush the surface of the black water. It creates a severely restricted field of vision. We could not see more than 30 feet in any direction, surrounded by a maze of identical trees and submerged logs. We maintained a tight formation, Caius paddling perhaps 20 feet to my starboard side, strictly checking our compass bearings every few minutes to ensure we were following the main channel of the creek and not wandering off into the flooded backwoods. It was dead silent. There were no birds, no insects, and no wind. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic slicing of our carbon fiber paddles entering and exiting the water. It was approximately 8:45 a.m. when the auditory anomaly began. It started as a heavy, dragging splash. At first, my brain rationalized it as Caius striking a submerged cypress knee with his paddle blade. I glanced over to my right. Caius was perfectly still, his paddle resting horizontally across the spray skirt of his kayak. He was staring out into the white fog, his head tilted. He looked over at me and pointed his finger out into the swamp, silently asking if I heard it too. I nodded. We both stopped paddling, letting our kayaks drift sluggishly in the minimal current, and just listened. The sound was not a paddle. I need to make that distinction incredibly clear. A kayak or canoe paddle enters the water with a clean slice and exits with a soft drip. What we were hearing was a heavy, blunt impact. It was a thick wooden pole driving down into the muddy bottom of the swamp, followed by a wet, sucking sound as it was wrenched free, and the subtle, heavy displacement of a wide, flat-bottomed vessel gliding forward. Someone was punting a boat through the flooded timber, and it did not sound distant. In the heavy fog, it sounded like it was perhaps 60 feet away, paralleling our position in the dense, unnavigable section of the flooded forest off to our left. Caius quietly suggested it was likely just a local fisherman or a park ranger checking boundary markers, which was a perfectly logical assumption. There are people who use flat-bottomed john boats or traditional pirogues in the shallow swamps. Standard protocol in a low-visibility marine environment is to make your presence known to avoid a collision. Caius cupped his hands and shouted a greeting into the fog, his voice echoing flatly against the wet bark of the surrounding trees. There was no verbal response. More concerningly, the poling did not pause. A normal person would stop pushing their boat to listen, or at least break their rhythm in surprise. But whoever was maneuvering that vessel did not alter their cadence by a fraction of a second. Thud, squelch, glide. Thud, squelch, glide. We resumed paddling, adopting a slightly faster, more deliberate stroke, figuring we would either outpace them or the channel would naturally widen. But over the next half hour, the creeping dread set in. That heavy, plunging sound never faded. It never grew closer, and it never fell behind. It mirrored our exact speed through an environment that should have made that impossible. We were in sleek, hydrodynamic touring kayaks, navigating the deepest part of the creek. Whoever was parallel to us was pushing a flat, heavy boat through a dense thicket of submerged cypress knees, fallen logs, and thick mud. To maintain that perfect, unbroken rhythm through such severe obstacles was not just impressive, it was bordering on mechanically impossible. The relentless consistency of the noise began to erode my nerves. It was intoxicatingly precise, like a metronome ticking away in the suffocating white mist. We stopped talking entirely. The tension radiating from Caius was palpable. We were both hyper-focused on the fog wall to our left. Around 9:30 a.m., the creek made a sharp, sweeping bend to the south. As we navigated the turn, the heavy canopy broke for just a moment, allowing a weak shaft of gray daylight to thin the fog. For a window of perhaps 4 seconds, the white veil parted. Sitting in the black water, roughly 50 yards away among the dense cypress trunks, was an incredibly old, weathered wooden punt. It was dark, rotting, and sat exceptionally low in the water. Standing at the very stern of the boat was a figure. It was abnormally tall, draped in something dark and heavily saturated that clung to its frame. I could not see a face, only the fluid, continuous motion of its arms, lifting a massive, blackened wooden pole and driving it down into the black water. Then the fog seamlessly closed back over the gap, swallowing the boat entirely. I looked at Caius. His face was entirely drained of color. We didn't exchange a single word. We didn't need to. We dug our paddles in and sprinted. I paddled with an aggressive, burning intensity, tearing through the water, ignoring the risk of submerged debris. The psychological weight of that silent, towering figure operating that boat with such mechanical indifference was profoundly terrifying. We pushed ourselves to the absolute physical limit, navigating blindly through the whiteout. And still, directly to our left, echoing through the fog, thud, squelch, glide. It matched our sprint flawlessly. After what felt like hours of agonizing pursuit, the channel abruptly widened, dumping us into a shallow, open oxbow lake known as Weston Lake. The fog was finally beginning to lift, burning off the open water. Directly ahead of us was a high, sloping bank of dense gray clay, marking a piece of elevated ground that the floodwaters hadn't breached. We drove our kayaks straight into the mud, not caring about scratching the holes. I ripped my spray skirt off and vaulted out into the knee-deep, freezing water, dragging the bow of my boat up onto the dry clay. Caius was beside me a second later, his chest heaving, his eyes frantically scanning the open water behind us. The lake was entirely empty. The fog was thinning into wispy strands, revealing hundreds of yards of still, undisturbed black water. The poling sound had completely stopped. We stood there in the absolute silence, the adrenaline slowly leaching out of our muscles. I felt a wave of intense relief wash over me. We were on solid ground. We had outpaced it, and the visibility was returning. Caius walked a few yards up the slick clay bank to secure his bowline to a sturdy root. I watched his shoulders suddenly drop. He froze, staring down at the ground. He slowly raised his hand and gestured for me to come up the bank. When I reached his side and looked down, the bottom fell out of my stomach. Pressed deeply into the gray clay were footprints. They were bare feet, unusually elongated, with toes that dug fiercely into the mud. They were flawlessly fresh. The murky swamp water was still actively draining into the deep impressions they left behind. But it was the trajectory of the prints that paralyzed me. The footprints emerged directly out of the deep water, walked up the bank, passed exactly 3 feet away from where we had just dragged our kayaks, and continued along the ridge before cutting sharply into an impenetrable wall of switchcane and thorns. I traced the path backward with my eyes. The prints originated from a spot further down the bank to our right. Whoever or whatever had made them had poled through the swamp, arrived at this exact elevated bank before us, walked up out of the water, strolled casually past the precise patch of mud we would eventually land on, and vanished into a thicket so dense a deer couldn't push through it. Caius stated, with a voice entirely devoid of emotion, that we needed to leave immediately. But my brain was stuck on a loop of terrifying, impossible logistics. I needed to see where the prints started. I needed to see the water's edge. I forced myself to walk 20 yards down the bank, following the tracks backward to their origin point. Sitting half-dragged onto the mud was the dark, rotting wooden punt. It was the exact same vessel I had seen through the break in the fog. The wood was black with age and rot, and the massive, muddy pole was resting inside the hull. The water around the stern was still swirling slightly from where it had been aggressively shoved onto the land. I stared at it, a cold, sickening horror taking root in my chest. We had sprinted across that water in high-performance kayaks. We had taken the most direct, deepest route. For that entity to be here, it would have had to pull that heavy, rotting box through a dense maze of submerged trees faster than we could paddle, reach this specific bank, disembark, walk the length of the ridge, and disappear into the brush. And it would have had to accomplish all of that before we even broke the tree line into the open lake, all without making a single sound of rushing water or breaking branches. It was a physical, geographical impossibility. Caius grabbed my shoulder harness and physically yanked me back toward the kayaks. We shoved off the mud bank and paddled the remaining miles to the ranger station in complete, terrified silence. I have run countless rivers and navigated hundreds of miles of remote wilderness since that day in 2018, but I will never return to Congaree, and I cannot tolerate the sound of a heavy piece of wood striking mud.